innovative approaches, initiatives that are happening. So we look forward to hearing from our speakers on some of the work that they've been seeing happening in this industry, with this focus. But before that, I do want to get into just a little bit of housekeeping. And part of the role of the coalition is to build relationships. And certainly that's not easy to do via Zoom, but we try to encourage it in different ways. And one being, just through the chat box. If you're able to let us know you're here, put some information about your company, yourselves, your email, your LinkedIn, with the idea is that hopefully people will connect or meet up for virtually or for coffee later on. But the idea is the more we can connect and build a relationship, the stronger this area will be. We will also be recording this event too. So, and when we send out a follow-up email to all the attendees, we'll include a link to the recording as well as a link to all the information in the chat box. So, so just to let you know. Also, a big thank you to today's sponsors. We wouldn't want to be doing this event without you. So thank you to AHP Architects, the BSC Group, and Reamer and Bronstein. You guys are great. We greatly appreciate your support. A couple of other meetings that are coming up, just wanted to let you guys know. So tomorrow there's going to be one with Representative Lori Trahan. This is done in conjunction with the Greater Lowell Chamber of Commerce. It's only a half hour, so if you're interested in hearing what's going on with Congresswoman Trahan, tune in. You can register via our website, and Steph, maybe we can put a link to in the chat box. We also have a real estate and infrastructure subcommittee meeting that's coming up. We don't have an exact date because we're trying to bring our utility companies together to hear from them, hear what some of the work that they're doing, some of the updates. So if you would like to be involved with whether this subcommittee or other subcommittees, let us know. We'd love for your input. And then we also have a sustainable real estate development meeting next month, and we've got a number of other meetings that we're scheduling. So just stay tuned for that. And this is just an agenda before I hand it over to Demetrius, just to let you know that we are hopefully, I guess it's up to our moderator, but hopefully we'll leave time for Q&A with the panelists. There were some that were submitted with the registration, but if you have questions, again, just throw them into the Q&A or the chat box, whatever. And we're going to end at 1. So like I said earlier, we're putting everybody on on the webinar. We're making it a webinar so that you can sit back, enjoy your lunch while we eavesdrop on our, we call it panelists or attendees. I don't know exactly what we call our experts. I'm going to say experts, but thank you everyone for joining today's conversation. And now let's meet everybody. So first, thank you to Demetrius Vanius, President of Land and Sea. And Demetrius, I think we said this was our 6th one that we're doing.
Yes.
And they're going. I always learn something. I always walk away learning something. They go by quickly and I think you enjoy them because I get that energy that you do enjoy the conversation as well too. So thank you for leading the conversation. Thank you to our panelists as well too. I see John Ings, Vice President of Meridian Associates. John McCartan. I don't see him here yet, but I believe he's going to be joining the conversation.
I'm here.
Okay, thank you for joining us, John. And John is the Regional Housing and Land Use Planner for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. I see Tom Skian, CEO and founder of Streamline Communities, and Craig Thomas, Deputy Director of Planning and Development for the City of Lowell. Thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation. I'll stop my share, and then now, John, I can see you. So thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation. And Demetrius, I will turn it over to you now.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, Stephanie. Welcome all to the panel. I really appreciate it. I do have to say, in looking at the, I just kind of noticed on the picture of this event, Mr. Ings, you're so like young and clean shaven in that picture, and you've got a great beard now, which is I appreciate a good beard. So
it's all due to COVID.
It's all due to
COVID beard.
Awesome. I like it. It's good. It's good. Again, thank you all for joining us. Basically, let's just go around and just give a brief introduction of who you are, what your company is, and things like that, and then we'll get into the conversation. So I'm going to go the way I see it to my right, I'm going to start with Tom, please.
Thank you, Demetrius. Tom Scan, I'm the New Homes CEO for Streamline Communities. We're a real estate advisory, marketing, sales, and leasing company, and we service residential builders throughout New England. I'm also the founder of Home Restart, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we serve the underserved from a real estate perspective, getting them into affordable housing using our real estate expertise.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Since I have two Johns, I'm gonna have to address you as Mr. just so to make things easier. So Mr. Rings, I'll start with you.
Thank you. John Ings with Meridian Associates. We're a civil engineering, land surveying, landscape architecture. We also do scanning and LiDAR work. We have our main office is in Beverly, and we have another office in Westboro. My home office is in Wilmington, so we do a lot of work in Lexington, so we're active and right around the Middlesex 3 area.
Thank you so much. And our other John.
Thank you. John McCartan, Regional Housing and Land Use Planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, sometimes called MAPC. We're the regional planning agency for the greater Boston region. So that's Boston and the 100 cities and towns surrounding it, including a lot of the Middlesex 3 region, though I don't think all of it. Yeah, with my team, we work on a range of projects, housing production plans, rezoning plans, actual like site disposition and preparing RFPs. So a bunch of work for cities and towns, and for me, all of it related to housing.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Craig.
Craig Thomas. I'm the Deputy Director for Planning and Development for the City of Lowell. My team works a lot with infrastructure, green and open space, as well as the federal funds that a lot of folks use to support various kinds of, affordable workforce and even market rate housing with some of the new state incentives. So personally, I also spent a little time in between stints at the City of Lowell working at a CDC. So I've been working on housing in a variety of ways over my profession.
Great, great. Thank you so much. And for those of you who don't know me, in our audience, my name is Demetrius Benes. I'm the president and co-owner of Land and Sea Real Estate with my wife Joanne. We're based in Andover. We focus primarily on investors and developers throughout the region. We're licensed in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, but we do things all over the U.S. working with a variety of clients. So that's kind of our world. So and as part of this, as Stephanie and I were talking about this years ago about starting this real estate webinar, it's very interesting how things have shifted in the past year. As when we first started talking about this, our topics have shifted dramatically, and there are just topics I wouldn't have talked about this year. We're talking about, in this series we talked about restaurants and for example, or what's happening with retail, kind of fallout and some other financing issues, and just kind of due to COVID and doing some of these other issues happening with the capital markets, our focus has shifted on this, which has been quite interesting. And I think today's topic has a lot to do with that, primarily because we are seeing a major exodus out of Boston in general into the suburbs, into some of the other cities, and how we're going to handle that. So what I want to throw out first, and it's just kind of we're talking innovative housing. What are we actually meaning by innovative housing? And I think through this conversation, we're going to help define that. But I think firstly, we need to kind of decide who is the innovating housing for? Is there an undeserved population? Is there, a population that's not being served by housing or is having other issues finding housing? We all know there's a housing crisis. We see it in the news all the time, see it in the paper. Massachusetts has this great housing crisis. But for a lot of us, we're, I think, a little separate from that. So, how do we define that, and who's really being affected by that kind of on the macro level? So I'm just going to go around this as a conversation, but Tom, I'm going to let you lead that off. Your thoughts.
So unfortunately, I'm not seeing a lot of innovation as it relates to satisfying the needs of the whole population. We sell new homes, so one of the biggest trends I'm seeing in the suburbs or the smaller cities outside of Boston are, mid-rise communities in a downtown location. So we're currently working on something in Reading, Portsmouth, Chelmsford, Groton, where we've got stack flat, single level living, 20, 30, 40 units, very walkable. Some have retail, some don't. Underground parking, sizable spaces where you can have an office, maybe even extra space for exercise facility. But really the main amenities are the town itself. But as I say, unfortunately, we're not seeing it. Everybody's getting priced out. I mean, because it's new, the price points are very high, and it's not a first-time home buyer. It's really a 50-plus buyer that can afford to purchase new construction, and they just want to be in a downtown location.
Well, that causes, I think, thanks, Tom, that causes a lot of maybe challenges for both the towns and then for developers. And so I'm gonna, throw this over to John Ings for a minute and just say, well, I mean, insofar as that goes, as a civil engineer and seeing the challenges thereof of how developers are dealing with this, because we do have the issues of a lack of land and we have the issues of price on top of it. So we're gonna go over to you.
Yeah, I think, I guess the word is unfortunately, the higher end or the normal housing market hasn't really cooled off a whole lot. And so developers that I've seen, they really aren't changing their tactics a whole lot. That the demand for what they were building before hasn't changed. And I think that's something we societally, we have to address. I think that's already been sort of mentioned. In my neighborhood, actually right across the street, it was about a year ago, as this whole thing was starting, a house went up for sale across the street. I thought to myself, gosh, I would not want to be doing that in this time. They had one weekend of an open house, 3 days of open house, and it sold in that one weekend. That has repeated itself again in another house down the street. I don't think the housing market has cooled off one bit because of COVID, maybe actually got worse. So the developers are kind of still doing what they were doing. We haven't even seen a large drop off in the work that we do in the residential area.
Interesting. So one of the issues again seems to be obviously lack of inventory is huge, but also affordability. And so for that, maybe let's kind of look at. I'm going to actually throw it to our other John on this, insofar as kind of what's the state looking at? What are their incentives? What is this? And it's not just, at one point we think of affordable, we think of a certain demographic, but that's really not the reality anymore. I mean, affordable seems to be affecting everybody because of prices. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's important whenever we talk about affordable housing that in at least the greater Boston region, which, when we're talking about federal standards, that would include some of the cities left out of the MAPC region. So Lowell, for instance, when we're talking about affordable housing there, 80% AMI, that's a very, most, I think, people's gut reaction to what that income actually is, which is, I believe in the high 80s for a family of four, if I'm not incorrect there. That's like a fairly high income from like a sort of gut check perspective. Most people hear that when they think about affordable housing, low income housing, they're not thinking that maybe a family making that much would be eligible. So I think whenever we talk about affordable housing, we kind of want to clear the air and say, all right, our housing programs are actually eligible to what we think of as being, certainly moderate income people from a sort of societal, general language sort of perspective. So I want to point that out, but then also I think we should say the state has a number of responses that it's sort of been working on, a lot of good examples of these programs that try to induce affordability, both deed restricted affordable and sort of naturally occurring affordable things like Chapter 40R, which is your smart growth district, quote unquote smart growth district. There are some things in the latest housing choice language that recently passed the State House that would get to affordability. There's also some things in the economic development bond bill that do put more money into smart growth or related initiatives to try to bring affordability to the table in these areas.
Very cool. And so then Craig, what are you seeing, especially in the city of Lowell, which is one of the largest cities in the state, and you're dealing with a lot of high density living, and and of course affordability is a big issue there. But I do a lot of work in the city of Lowell, and I've seen the prices skyrocket in the last 5-7 years into just a phenomenal percentage. And so what are your observations?
Yeah, thanks, Dimitri. I want to pick up on what John at MAPC was saying, and there's a lot of different responses to this, but one that I've been thinking about, and we've been talking about it as a team, it's sort of the missing middle to a certain extent, that there is the affordable housing stock, which is not enough, but subsidized by the state. When we can find sites, the various programs that John mentioned, as well as some of the larger ticket items, tax credits, and otherwise, there's money there to build those projects. We've talked about the high end, the $2,000, $2,500, $3,000 apartments. The market returns cover the investment costs there. But in the middle, we're really starting to struggle a little bit with either what it's called naturally affordable housing that's starting to go away, or a place where it's hard to build new units and it's hard to keep them up at a high quality. So it's a place that we're trying to figure out with our existing landlords, amongst many considerations. How can we work here? Whether it's workforce housing program, rolled out by the state in partnership with Mass Housing, or otherwise that, we need to target this area, as John said, which is at least the vast majority of our residents qualify for, housing up to that income level. 100% AMI is, almost 2/3 of Lowellians by income.
And I want to get back to workforce housing in a little bit, but one thing that I'm hearing is the idea. We keep going back to the idea of affordability, and once upon a time, less than a generation ago, we'd have the concept of the starter home. And people could, you're 24, you're 25, you get your first job, and you can kind of the American dream of getting your first home. And that number is steadily creeped up insofar as age of first-time home buyer. And now that's well into the mid-30s, which is a huge jump in just a generation. It's a 10-year, in essence, a 10-year jump in a generation. And because of that as well, a lot of that has to do with the price of homes in this area, but also for the poor, for the developers, they can't make a profit unless the houses are at a certain point level, because they can't build starter homes. You're going to lose money on starter homes. They have to be building $700,000, $800,000, $1 million homes just so they can turn a profit. So with these kind of two issues balancing each other, what are our alternatives? What are the alternatives to housing? This is where the innovative housing comes in. How do we become creative on this? And I'm just going to leave this out there. Whoever wants to jump in, let's keep it a conversation. Anyone?
I'll talk a little bit about, I guess, 40B housing. So what's interesting is there's a cap on it, and it's a 20% cap in terms of profitability that you can make. And I think it's a little bit broken. And because on the surface, you look at that and go, wow, 20% return, that's awesome, right? But the risk that a developer takes to go into a project like that and build out affordable homes really at a loss is a significant risk. And a great example is, lumber prices have gone up 100%. So on average, that's $25,000 per unit. Okay, so you can wipe out your percentages very quickly because of the risk that you're taking. So what I'm seeing with the smaller 40B developments is builders are just saying, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to take the risk. But why would you put a cap on a builder that wants to build affordable homes and wants to take the risk? It seems like the incentive should be there for the upside. if you're the one that's going to throw down, millions of dollars in equity and put your name on the dotted line. So.
Good, thank you. You guys want to answer to that?
Well, I can jump in from a municipal perspective in that, sometimes 40B is an example where, it's a developer versus a city or versus the residents. And I think part of the innovative housing, to get to innovative housing solutions, we just prioritize housing as communities. It sounds really simple, but we have to think about how to, as we start to do our plans, not just our zoning plan, but that's important, our zoning ordinance, but our master plan, our open space plan. We have to build housing in so that we can figure out where we want housing. We have to start to identify, not just in a housing production plan, but where we want housing and where we can make it easy. And that's where housing choice is going. It's starting to go down the road of how to add both incentives, but also add tools to make it easier. And we as the public sector need to try and make it a little bit simpler, help them get to yes about where they need to
I think building off of that, Tom mentioned that it's broken. And another aspect of that, going along with the planning, a lot of times developers, that's kind of their big stick that they keep on the side. And, they go in with a plan, and when that plan isn't going to work, that's when they take the 40B out and they say, okay, well, we're going to make it work. And here's how we're going to make it work. So on the front end, if there was more planning and cooperation and everybody got to the table with a goal of housing in mind, maybe that would help the situation as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, up from MAPC's perspective, I think, we're rarely, I can't think of an example of when we're saying 40B development is the solution for a community, precisely because it's built in this antagonistic relationship. There are these caps. It's sort of not the optimal planning tool. It can be useful in certain circumstances, especially the sort of, quote, friendly 40Bs, where you essentially bring in zoning flexibility that way. But it's really not the, it's not a silver bullet for any of this. We're thinking more in terms of how we can bring in different typologies, housing typologies into communities where they might not exist already. Things that might even feel, like they would fit in a historically single family community. So things like cottage housing and other sort of smaller housing examples where you can get densities up to a level where the land price, per unit starts to make a little more sense for dropping the final retail price of the home. So that's where a lot of our, more interesting suburban work is going. And so that's kind of exciting. It is, I'm sure, like a cat and mouse game. Like as soon as you up densities, like, all right, maybe the land price adjusts. So it's not a silver bullet either, but it's just something we're thinking about as opposed to that 40B development.
John, if you could for our audience in general, could you actually give me a 2-sentence definition of a 40B for everybody?
All right, so
terms thrown around that those of us in the industry know what it is, but some people might not. So, if you can.
So yeah, a 40B development is essentially when a developer says we can ignore your local zoning rules and other things like historical guidelines because you don't have enough deed restricted affordable housing in your community. So the state says if you have less than 10% affordable housing, a developer can come in and more or less ignore your zoning, and it's a harder process than that. But and the city or town can't really do anything about it. As a trade-off, some of that housing has to be affordable.
Thank you. I want to just stay on the 40B topic just for a moment, then I want to go to some other things. But I do want to make a couple comments. Primarily, the biggest issue with 40B development is kind of the NIMBY issue, the not in my backyard. Everybody thinks it's the greatest idea in the world. It's like, oh yes, we need affordable housing. Now it suddenly goes, a developer, presents this to a town, and suddenly everybody's up in arms. Oh, we don't want that here. We don't want high density living. We don't want the traffic. We don't want to have to deal with it. Where are they going to park? And parking is a whole other issue, in these types of situations. So where are you going to park? Oh, you can't park in the street. You're going to build a parking garage. or you're going to build it underneath, and suddenly your prices skyrocket for the developer. But on top of that, I think the biggest challenge is a lot of towns are concerned about their school systems, about if you bring in high density living into a town, suddenly the school system is going to be overrun and they're not going to be able to handle it. And I think that's one of the great challenges that I've seen. I'd like any of you to speak to that. And John, we kind of chat about that a little bit.
I think if you design something, you can target the buyer and still satisfy the affordability needs. So if you're building first floor masters, guess what? You're going to get the 50+ buyer. You're not necessarily going to get, families that want the kids upstairs and they're downstairs. So you can create targeted with the design.
Yeah, from what research MAPC has done on this, as a general rule, you're never going to solve your school enrollment problem by restricting development, because typically the new development is not what's driving enrollment. It's, demographic changes, it's turnover in your single family housing stock. I mean, there's certainly some communities where development's going to play a role. And if a school is right at the edge of capacity, like, yeah, development could cause a problem. But as we think of that as a school and school funding issue, not necessarily as a development issue.
Good. I'm going to want to swing back to a topic, and we'll throw this to Craig. Could you talk to us a little bit about workforce housing? Because that's been another one of those kind of hot catchphrases, and maybe you can kind of enlighten the audience of what that means, particularly because it's important in Lowell.
Yeah, I'll try. I took a look at the list. So I think most folks are fairly technical, but I'll still just give a little background. John at MAPC mentioned AMI. It's the area median income. How the federal government, at least through their funds, demonstrates affordability, and it's for a region. And so, when you talk about a percentage, it says this is the regional median income. If you're at a certain level of that, below it, you can have access to affordable housing. But as John was also saying, we've been talking about here about, the escalation in prices impacts everyone. Folks who are now at the median income in Lowell and in fact above it are starting to look around, and we're starting to talk to folks who are saying it just that first home, as Demetrius, you were saying, is out of reach. And so this idea that there actually needs to be subsidy in that middle, I was talking about, and not at the highest end, where even in Lowell, where we have Boston construction prices, but not the rental return market, highest end can still generally support itself. In this middle, where folks who are not typically families with incomes that wouldn't strike you as needing subsidy or aren't of an existing program, they are looking at the prices and can't afford it. Workforce housing is really about a modest level of support for housing for all of us, right? I mean, vast majority of folks, not folks at the lowest income or the units that are very restrictive, and not the unrestricted open market, but a wide range, typically around 100% of the area median income, that needs some amount of support. Again, it's a new idea for some folks that people making the area median income 100% need some support. The land prices escalating with the rents escalating, and these developments being harder to get into the ground, we found that this is a program that has real idea, that has a lot of support, and a program that has helped us in Lowell at least unlock one major development that's going to bring mixed income development for affordable workforce and market rates, sort of the income tiers of housing. And it wouldn't have been able to do it without this idea, and folks will really benefit from this.
Beautiful. Thank you. So I want to kind of run with this a little bit with Tom and Mr. Ings on this. Insofar as we've talked about the 40Bs, which have been around for a while, the workforce housing also has been around for a while, but it's becoming more and more to the fore. What other kind of creative solutions are you gentlemen seeing? Are you seeing anything what developers might be doing, or John, what developers are asking you to look for, and what your challenges are with that as well? So I'm going to kind of throw it to you two to start this conversation of, or what else? What other types of innovations we start to see to alleviate our crisis issues?
So I think I'm actually going to answer one of the questions that we got in the packet from Stephanie. It talked about transportation and the impact of building near transportation. I think that we are seeing, transportation oriented districts and housing being developed around that. I think that kind of couples with mixed use residential and having so I don't want to concentrate on COVID too much, but it's so much of a impact on where I think we're going, and it's we're sort of in this experiment right now, and it's interesting to see what is going to happen, at least in the near future, right? And so we've actually been approached. We're working on proposing on a project in Somerville, and it's got the proposal is to put retail on the front end, right on the frontage, and then parking on grade level in the back, and then so you'll have the residential will be above that, so that and it's right near, I think it's the green line, right near transportation. So that kind of puts everything into a package. You got the mixed use, you got the transportation, the parking, and I think that might be sort of a stepping stone for people that are, Demetrius, you already talked about it, people are coming out of the city. Well, there's people that like city living, and maybe that's where they're going to end up, is in a, it'll still be the density that they're used to, but it won't be the volume, if you will. So that may be part of the aspect of that.
Oh,
Yeah, so I would love to give you an innovative solution, but as I sit here listening to John, I'm really struggling, and I think with COVID, the trends are accelerating. So what's been bad from an affordability perspective is about to get a whole lot worse. Before we jumped on the call, I looked at some of the numbers in Middlesex County. There are 500 homes in Middlesex County on the market. That's about, I don't know, like 8 per town, 9 per town. So, the Boston Globe ran a great article this weekend called "Availability is the New Affordability," meaning if someone's willing to spend $500,000 right now on something that's not worth it, like they're out there, those buyers are out there ready to pay for something that's not worth it, but there's nothing there. And these are people with money that can't find it. So the people without money aren't going to find it. And I think this is the way it was 15 years ago, where Massachusetts is on the cusp of a real issue of not being able to sustain our affordability issue. I think it's becoming a huge issue.
right. Yeah, no, it is a huge issue. In fact, that was kind of in a way, you kind of led into my next question, which is, all right, so what are the rest of us, what do we do? Where do we find land? What other ways can we find some type of house? How can we also create creative housing? What else can we do? I mean, one thing, just maybe to lead the question a little bit, I mean, there's one thing that one of my clients does in Lowell is renovating mill buildings, for example, industrial buildings. And there's been a talk about turning large retail plazas into house. I mean, they're also talking about turning it into distribution centers, but also adding a housing component or renovating factory buildings of this. And what's the future of this? What are you guys seeing insofar as how that might be going, and the support from the communities and from the state? Turning a Simon Mall into a residence with warehouses underneath.
I like that idea better than purchasing permits and going after ground up. because you're getting permits at a lower price point. You're fixing an eyesore in the town or city. You've got partial infrastructure there. There's still going to be a cost to renovate it, but it seems like a quicker way to get to a more affordable product.
Yeah, something I'll jump in and say that, you know, when we talk about innovative housing, we're already doing innovative. So take septic, right, or sewer. So for septic, we're already doing innovative and alternative solutions, and pretty quickly, the land that would apply to is it's not going to be there, right? And then we're not going to have an option on site disposal. So then you go to sewer, and that's costly if it's not already there. So point being, the available land is starting to become very rare that's buildable. And then we get into flooding and, you know, trying to forecast for the climate change and whatnot. So that the aspect of reuse of properties that have already been developed starts to become very attractive and a viable alternative.
Yeah, I'll jump in and follow that up. Demetrius, as you pointed out, we've had a lot of success in Lowell with adaptive reuse, starting with the mill buildings. Many folks probably know some of our residents there, but started to look at some of the more marginal buildings and the more marginal land, as you know, John at Meridian pointed out. And you know, there is still a desire we've seen from sort of sales and the lease up for people to reuse creatively some of our other kinds of buildings, our other building types, especially some of the historic and sort of core downtown, adjacent downtown properties. We're seeing more uptake of some of those for residential use where we wasn't sure if that was the right pathway up until very recently. So we've seen a lot of interest in that, and just thinking creatively about those more marginal areas that, as you say, starting to encroach in industrial, commercial. We've been taking up those conversations when people are starting to really think about it.
Yeah, I'll also throw in the example here of Haverhill, which did a lot of work around mill building, adaptive reuse, pairing that with a 40R strategy to ensure some level of affordability and bringing resources back into the city as part of that conversion, you know, since 40R includes a payment by the state to the city. Now that they've sort of, you know, done that, they did that maybe, I don't know, a decade and a half ago. They're looking at, you know, some of these more marginal like village centers. So Haverhill, big place, it has rural areas in addition to the sort of downtown core, and looking at how they can adapt the land there, which I think, you know, portions of it are already served by that, you know, water and sewer infrastructure. So some of the, you know, single story retail at the sort of margins of town can be repurposed into a little mixed use village. So that's kind of an interesting turn they're taking since they've already done the mill renovation. I do also want to, since we're kind of on the subject here of adaptive reuse, there's a question in the chat about adapting office space. I would say I'm sure John can speak to this better than I can, but adapting an office floor plate for residential is extremely difficult and sort of results in a lot of dead space, a lot of new plumbing that has to go in. So it's kind of a big ask, and it's sort of on everyone's mind these days now that offices are office real estate is sort of being wrecked. So it's an interesting subject. It's definitely one of the harder things to do. If we can find an innovative solution around that, I think that would open up a lot of opportunity. The big opportunity that's maybe opened up by COVID is maybe hotels, since those are much more easily adaptable into residential.
We've got the plumbing in place.
Exactly.
And that's the biggest issue. No. In fact, that's interesting. That's been a topic that's been bounced around quite a bit, is the adaptation of hotels. Yeah, office is interesting. I mean, one of my clients is in Rhode Island is doing that with a large 200,000 square foot office building and turning it into apartments, just because they decided even with the plumbing, it's cost effective to do that because the building's practically empty. It's emptied out in the past year, so it sometimes makes more sense to do that. So I guess from what I hear from everybody, I wanted to kind of bring this to a point of we see what the issues are. We've thrown a couple solutions. So what needs to happen to make these things work? I mean, between that, so it benefits the town, it benefits the developers, and and mostly it benefits the population who you're trying to focus on. What needs to happen on kind of the macro level and on the micro level? Anyone? I feel like Alex Trebek sometimes on this. You can answer in the form of a question. That's perfectly fine as well.
So I'll answer from my perspective, because we work for the developers mostly, and we assist them in getting in front of the cities and towns and successfully getting their permitting done. And from my perspective, if there was, I guess I'll say longer term, maybe master planning, but if there was more cooperation from those two entities, it would, again, as I go back to the 40B, it takes away that antagonistic approach. If we could incentivize the right areas, maybe that middle income, that middle area that we're talking about, if we could incentivize that so the developers saw profit, if they were going to be profitable to be building in that arena, then the getting it past the permitting stage might be a little bit less complicated. So it's like that I talked about society has to kind of say we value getting people into homes and this level of housing, and put together incentives that the builders then say, yeah, we can work with that.
Yeah, I'll piggyback a little bit on what John's saying. It feels like perhaps to folks that there are a lot of incentives out there for the state, but they still are pretty well targeted and are oversubscribed. And so there's a question in the chat about financing tools, and most developments, when they come in, the developers, when we try and be as collaborative as we can, they lay out the pro forma in front of us and say, here's my gap. How do we get there? And we still have a very narrow set of tools to try and get there. And I don't know, but we continue to talk with our partners at the state and the quasi-governmentals about opportunities, and people are little bit pushing their ideas and their programs to be more creative, and using a collective voice to advocate that, even with the money on the table and some of the new programs that are rolling out, even just from the most recent bill, economic development bill, helpful, but we still need more. We still need to put our voice out there about where we see the gaps and how we can work together with our state partners.
I'll take it from a builder perspective too, because I represent builders. I feel like a lot of the builders know the towns that are difficult and the ones that are more, let's say, creative and want to work with them. And there's a big disparity between the two. And I think some of the towns have to take responsibility for getting the right people involved, whether it be from a regional perspective or local perspective, in putting better plans out there to attract creative, solutions for housing so that they can attract, builders. Like when we started off the conversation, I was talking about a lot of towns building stack flat development in the downtown location. That doesn't happen just overnight. Those are more progressive towns looking for that because they know it's going to revitalize the downtown area and the retail area, and they want people in the town, living, working, playing, walking around, all of that stuff. So I guess that would be my comment.
John?
Yeah, I would just piggyback on all of that. It's I think we need to connect housing to the visions people have of their community. Before I worked specifically on housing, I did a lot of master planning, and we do a lot of visioning around that. And people want sort of like, common sense things, like, they want community, they want vibrancy, they want, economic security and that sort of thing. So if we can, better communicate how housing is part of that picture, I think we'll go a long way. I think that's really the big challenge I see on a community level.
No, you did a great word there, was vision. You know, what does each community have for a vision of what that community is going to be? And as we all know, dealing with some of the town boards, planning boards and things like that, sometimes the system is somewhat antiquated in the process of getting things moving forward. It's that's a system that tends to kind of slow down the wheels of progress a little bit. And it's just because the system is slow in some instances. And so the idea of a vision, I think is a great way to look at it. So thanks for that, John. I appreciate it. I'm going to bring Steph Cronin back in. I think she has some questions that have kind of bounced around through the chat box. Anything you'd like to add, Stephanie? So.
Yeah, no, this has been a great discussion, and I appreciate this because I think we do have a lot of municipalities that are listening in, and I think this is a great way to educate and bring people together. So there have been a lot of questions coming in. I think you guys have been answering a lot of them as they've been coming in as well too. But there's one that I wanted to bring up as well too, which is how can towns, or what can towns do with their bylaws that would make it easier and more affordable to builders to build their first home, or for first home buyers.
First home buyers.
Are you,
And
I
Tom,
guess,
maybe,
is
because
that like a, I don't know, like some sort of overlay in a town that would be attractive to a builder to come in to build? I think overlay districts work great. And it goes back to what these guys were saying about vision. So where are we going to put these overlay districts to attract the builders to come in and build product A, product B, so that we can, kind of house, specific people? Back to the vision. So.
and Tom, it kind of goes back to also what you said too, is you said that the builders know the towns that are easier to work in. I'm wondering if the towns know which towns are easier to work in, because sometimes when you're working with a town, you don't necessarily know what goes on outside your town. So do towns know, like, this is a great example of how to do it well?
I will say that, just to throw in real quickly, I will say that I do work with a number of developers from outside the region in different states. And I was dealing with one in Colorado who was looking to go into this area. And I said, well, how about this town? And they said, absolutely not. That town has a reputation. Like, how do you possibly know this town? Being in Colorado, it's like, oh, we know. We've done it, but we're not going to do anything with that town because we've heard horror stories. And that's, that happens quite a bit. And those reputations are hard to shake. So I'm going to let Tom kind of finish with that. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret. I know a builder, I won't specify, who is trying to get an affordable product in a town, and he found out during COVID that the town was having Zoom meetings for a specific group of developers for the stuff they wanted built. But for his particular 40B development, they kept using the excuse, COVID. So they were discriminating against them, clearly, to the point where, they had to make some noise. And these guys all talk, and they know who's being difficult and who's not. And quite frankly, they want to work with the ones that have a vision. And want to get something done, collectively. They'd rather not go the 40B route and go the friendly route and come out with a better product that kind of is more appealing to their constituents and, from a profitability perspective too.
Stephanie, sorry, just to jump in, I see at least one of my staff members in the group. They'll know that I have a tendency to combine a couple ideas sometimes. I think maybe one way to think about the answer about bylaws also gets to another question in the chat about land trusts. There's the regulatory side we've been talking about, but then there's just the cost side. How do you simplify and reduce the costs and do it in a way from the public sector where those costs are then passed along to the buyers. So this is hard, and you have to get creative. Land trusts, which I one in Lowell, but doesn't own a lot of land. It's one model. You take out the cost of land from the equation, and then you use that to help build in an affordability restriction. So thinking about what you as a municipality can do on the cost side as well. We don't have a lot of tools or levers over there because we don't own a lot of land to make available. But to think about that, both the land trusts, which there are models for that, and other ways to help the builders to lower their costs while also, making sure they keep that and pass it along to the buyer.
Yeah, I do love the land trust idea because it's the owner, whether it's a city or some sort of nonprofit entity, can sort of retain control and ensure some level of affordability. They're very difficult to scale. There's a lot of very small land trusts in Massachusetts. Actually, there's a long history of them, but they tend to stay very small just because it's it doesn't work like anything else in real estate, where real estate is sort of scales and builds on itself. Land trusts are exactly the opposite. They're intending not to build on themselves. So I love them as ideas. I think if we can be innovative of how they scale, that would be an interesting solution. But no answers from me yet.
Well, I think one thing that we just need to keep cognizant too, and this kind of goes with the N3 mission as well, is we have to see, where do these suburbs, how far do they start going out? When does that commute to Lowell become an hour and a half from, Belchertown or something, right? And you have to go, and that's your commute, because that's the only place you can find land to build. So, and what does that traffic start to look like? So it's these things we have to start thinking about it as far as vision and going forward and how we're going to accommodate for such things. And I know there's a question about traffic as well, or and parking, and how that gets pulled into this as well, which is a conversation purely by itself. The challenges of how do you deal with traffic issues, and how do you deal with parking, particularly in urban areas.
So Demetrius, to sort of answer the question about the bylaws and about traffic, we have started to see that if we are building in an area that does have it's readily accessible by public transportation, we have seen where they relax the requirements on parking. It makes sense, right? That you take the density of the building that you're putting in, and half those people are going to get on the train versus have a car. It's logical, and cities and towns are starting to say, okay, we'll buy into that. I don't know of anywhere that's really made that a bylaw change, if you will, but there have been exceptions made for that aspect of building.
Yeah, if I can follow that up, in the city of Lowell, we're thinking along the same lines. We used a grant from the Housing Choice Program. We're doing a citywide parking study. People were a little confused about why we were doing a parking study with housing money, but this is absolutely critical to figure out how can we start to be innovative and unlock a site that's not developable now, but to make a clear argument to our residents and stakeholders that we can build thoughtfully that meets everyone's needs, and to have, plan and a vision for how we do that and how we marshal those kinds of developments forward, parcel by parcel and neighborhood by neighborhood.
Excellent. So Stephanie, anything else from the gallery?
There are a few more questions. One's coming in now as well too. But I do want to go back to the land trust comment too, because I think that is something that we haven't talked about much at Middlesex 3, and perhaps we should. And John, maybe if you have information that you could be sharing with the group as well too, on some best practices and such, we'd love to hear more of what other people have been doing as well too. And Eric Salerno, you have some long questions here. So I'm gonna read them out. But there's one on senior housing and how to be more creative and encourage more density with senior housing. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being completely transformative, how much of an impact do the panelists think the housing choice bill will have on the Commonwealth over the next decade? That's a good question. And well, I think that there'll be a lot of conflict and complaining. It has tremendous potential. it was introduced to come up with more creative zoning changes to promote more density, more dense housing, which is needed and such. So let's leave it at that. What are your thoughts about the housing choice bill?
Well, I don't know what it is. So.
Oh, okay. John, Craig, do you guys want to jump in?
I definitely have thoughts. I think.
Can you give us just like a sentence long definition of it?
So it's, I'm certainly not the expert. It's way more complicated than this. The big takeaway is that zoning changes no longer take a supermajority to pass in municipalities. So it used to take 66% of, say, a town meeting or a city council vote. Now it's going to take 50% plus one. So that's the big change. I think in the next 10 years we'll start to see modest changes. So maybe like a 3 or a 4. I think moving for zoning and development, the processes are just long. So I think over 20, 30 years it could have a much more significant change. The place where it doesn't really hit is those affordability questions outside of the market. So low income housing or even moderate income housing are going to be hard to provide one way or another. Inclusionary is off the table in housing choice. So inclusionary zoning, it's where a portion of development is set aside for affordable units. That still requires a supermajority vote. And then there's things like, tenants' rights and tenants' questions that are of course not a part of zoning at all. So I'm very bullish on it, but I understand its limitations.
Yeah, I can weigh in with a little bit. It does feel like a little bit of housing choice is a little more focused on some of the suburbs, probably for some of the rules. Eric also added about the requirement for by right multifamily. I think the most important part of housing choice is not where we are right now, but trying to get us all on the same page and moving forward, saying again, we have to prioritize housing and find ways to break through a little bit of this logjam. Demetrius, you mentioned NIMBYs before. There's a movement in planning circles about YIMBYs, trying to find those who say, yes, if you want development, I just want to have a conversation about how it can be designed and cited appropriately and find that right balance between so restrictive that we have discretionary review of every permit and you can build whatever you want. It's not quite respectful enough of our residents, but try and align that conversation and maybe even modernize the land use systems, in this Commonwealth. There's, in addition to housing choice, there's been various versions of, 40A update at the State House for many, many years. So there's a lot of little tweaks that we could see in the permitting conversation that could just help, little pieces that can help get people on the same page.
Okay. Steph, what do you think?
And well, we have 1 minute left here, and there is one comment. It's not necessarily a question on education funding and the impact on real estate as well too. I don't know if we can cover that in 1 minute because that is such a massive issue. But anybody want to address that comment by Rick Reed in terms of the impact of property taxes with housing, or the perceived impact as well? Am I asking too much in 1 minute? John? Putting you on the spot.
That is a lot to tackle in a minute. I mean, I think there's a lot of communities who are sort of on the edge with their school funding who are rightly nervous about how they're going to go forward with, say, capital improvements or hiring new teachers. Like, I'm very sympathetic to that, just because it's very difficult to do. Just talking to the superintendent of the Saugus public school system, it's a delicate balance always. I think I'll be honest, I don't know as much about education funding as I should. I know people talk about the formula. But I do encourage creativity, but I'm certainly not a subject matter expert. So I'll mute myself now.
Can I ask, before you do, can I ask, is it something that MAPC has tackled in the past? In other words, if communities are interested, could they follow up with you and at MAPC for more information?
They could certainly follow up with me, and I will find what resources we have. I know there's been research around the sources of school enrollment. I don't know if there's further research or policy guidance on alternative funding sources, but I can certainly ask around.
And thank you. And maybe that's a conversation for another day as well, too. And with that, I think I'm going to thank everybody. This has been a great conversation. Tom, Craig, John, Demetrius, always, it's a great conversation. There's a lot to think about. And I think it's really just the beginning. I'm wondering if anyone who's attending would like to follow up with you, if we can maybe in the chat provide information as well, too, for, to follow up. Because I think that this has started the conversation and there's a lot of additional discussion needed.
And it's a long-term conversation, because this is going to be an issue with for Massachusetts and just the Northeast in general for another generation anyway, before we can start figuring these things out. And this also starts to lead into one of our future topics on sustainable development as well, and how the infrastructure is going to handle that as things move forward. So they kind of go hand in hand.
So that will be next month. So with that, I'm over my time. So again, thank you. Thank you to our sponsors, AHP Architects, the BFC Group, and Reamer and Bronstein. We appreciate your support. And thank you everyone for your time today, your insights. It's been a great discussion.
Great. Yes, thank you all so much. This was fun, as always. And thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
My pleasure. My
Thank you
pleasure.
all.
Thank you.
Guys. Good catching up with everybody.
Yes.
Tom, appreciate all your insights. John, Craig, thank you.